right. I'm delighted to be here today and to show you, share with you this information about the book. It just came out in September, and as Alyssa said, it is part of the Interpreting History series from AASLH and Rowman and Littlefield. And it is typically for museum professionals. And they're a wonderful series of books. It really talks about how to address some of these complicated histories. And so I was very excited to get a contract with them to talk about the legacy of suffrage. For this book, I really wanted to expand it though, as Alyssa had said. I wanted to expand the content so that it would include materials that I believe are relevant to museum visitors, to donors, to board members, not just staff, because I feel if we are to address the racial disparities in what we think of as the typical suffrage narrative, then it's going to take a more holistic effort. To begin with, I share a series of case studies from 3 women's history sites that outline their efforts to address the bias and racism in their content. Then I give a concise overview of the 25th, 50th, and 75th anniversaries of the 19th Amendment. I look back on the cultural, political, and social issues leading up to each of those previous anniversaries, and this allows readers to have a better understanding of the interconnectedness of 100 years worth of women's rights campaigns, and I hope that it will give fresh insight into the recent centennial of 2020. Alyssa, the next slide, please. So in the book, there are 3 key questions that I try to answer. The first, why should museum visitors expect suffrage history exhibits to include issues around contemporary voting rights and citizenship? The second, how can museum staff correct the gaps in their existing programs and exhibits and ensure both a diverse and accurate narrative for their visitors? And 3, how can we all move away from using the very dismissive and tired trope of she was just a product of her time, instead of talking about the underlying basic bias and systemic racism? Next slide, please. So this book, the information in this book really stems from my firsthand experience of being the executive director of the Sewell Belmont House and Museum in Washington, D.C. Many of you have probably been there. It's an outstanding historic site, sits on the corner of Constitution Avenue and 2nd, directly across from the Supreme Court and right next to the Hart Building. My tenure actually began at the Sewell Belmont House on Women's Equality Day in 2008. So from that very, very first day, I was eager to delve into this rich history to talk about women's enfranchisement. Now, some of you may know that the Sewell Belmont House and Museum was the 5th and final headquarters for the National Woman's Party, which was an organization founded by Alice Paul. Next slide, please. The NWP is probably best known as the group that brought controversial tactics such as picketing the White House in the suffrage campaign's final years before the ratification of the 19th. Over the next 5 decades, NWP members wrote and lobbied for hundreds of local and national legislative measures that impacted women's lives both then and now, including the Equal Rights Amendment. Next slide. So when my tenure began in August of 2008, you all might recall that we were in the midst of the stock market downturn, resulting in what we now know was a global financial crisis. This negatively impacted Sewell Belmont House, as well as so many other institutions of all sizes. Given the increased financial insecurity, I made it a priority to reach out to key donors and stakeholders in an effort to begin building key relationships and hopefully securing their continued financial support. Within the first few weeks of my tenure, I had a very highly anticipated meeting set up with a longtime stakeholder to talk through my nascent plans for the museum. Our conversation quickly took an unanticipated turn. Next slide, please. Alyssa, thank you. Our conversation quickly took an unanticipated turn when she shared her viewpoint on racism in the suffrage movement, and in particular, labeled Alice Paul as a racist. Now, I assumed that she was referring to the well-known racial segregation during the women's suffrage procession of 1913. Next slide. Held on the eve of President-elect Woodrow Wilson's inauguration in Washington, D.C., African-American suffragists were expected to march at the back of the parade, or the more numerous and wealthy delegations representing the southern states had declared that they would not attend. Now, as a brand new executive director, I was nowhere near ready to broach this topic during an introductory meeting, and her comments, frankly, caught me off guard. But from today's vantage point, I realize how grateful I am that this conversation happened so early in my tenure, because the topic of racism in the suffrage movement has always been part of my thinking. And it's even continued to include and influence the work that I did at Sewell Belmont House, and it still continues today. So as I mentioned, one of my early goals was to reinterpret the exhibits and delve deeper into the controversial tactics and strategies and highlight not just the white women, but to also include the stories of the many women of color. Unfortunately, even though I was there for 9 years, I'm sorry to say that I made very little progress in addressing this important issue. And looking back, I realized that my inaction, my lack of the ability to get this done, really allowed an already narrowly focused historical interpretation of the National Woman's Party to continue unchecked for almost another decade. Now, my experience was not unique. And as I began to share my thoughts with my colleagues from the women's history field, we began what I would call a tacit exploration of the complicated racial tensions that exist within United States women's history. While we never second-guessed the need to tackle this and explore this critical issue at each of our respective institutions, we were also, frankly, unsure how to begin the dialogue. We thought that we had insufficient knowledge to navigate such a sensitive topic, and frankly, we were afraid of getting it wrong. Next slide, please. So in the 13 years since then, I believe that it's become perhaps even more complicated to have productive conversations about this issue. And when I say productive conversations, I mean going beyond simply trading sound bites about who was a racist or who wasn't a racist. Case in point, the recent backlash and efforts to refute the legal construct critical race theory rather than acknowledge and discuss systemic racism. Now, as a field, I don't believe that museums should avoid these questions or these issues. Instead, I think that we should work together with our communities, with our boards, with our staff, with our visitors to dig into these questions and talk about how we can create change. We need to make sure that it is not simply just an accusation, but it becomes a conversation. Next slide. I'm very grateful to my colleagues at 3 women's history sites who shared their progress as they worked to correct the gaps in their historical interpretations and acknowledge racism within their own institutions. Now, the goal in sharing these case studies is twofold. First, it's to examine and chronicle the ongoing efforts to repair the damage previously inflicted through racially insensitive interpretation. And second, to disseminate information throughout our field and encourage similar efforts at other historic sites and museums. When analyzing the 3 sites, the Greater Federation of Women's Clubs is just beginning to have these conversations. The National Woman's Party struggled for more than a decade to make progress, and the Frances Willard House launched Truth Telling, a successful public program and website. Now, to be clear, the reason that I include case studies in the book is not to judge or label the work at these sites. It's not up to me to say whether they were a success or a failure. Instead, it is to understand the process and the results so that we may better understand the difficulties in attempting of executing this type of work, as well as to generate new ideas that will help us navigate these common barriers that we face as a field. Next slide. So like other women's organizations of the time, the General Federation of Women's Clubs has a long history that is complicated by unaddressed issues of bias and racism. As shown in the case study offered by Alyssa Constat, early membership in the GFWC consisted mainly of wealthy, socially elite white women who were moved to promote public education, child labor laws, environmental regulation, and other issues which fit nicely into the package of domestic feminism. Despite their seemingly progressive agenda, serious inconsistencies emerge when viewing the GFWC through a modern lens. In addition, the Black women who were GFWC members were not always given the same opportunity to participate or to rise to leadership positions within the organization. Next slide. Jennifer Krafchick highlights the multiple attempts to explore the underlying aspects of racism within the ranks of the National Woman's Party. For many years, the primary narrative featured the efforts of white activists picketing the White House, marching in parades, and participating in other public events. This limited narrative remained generally unquestioned by the public, and it was applauded by the visitors, the donors, the staff, and the board. Though the historic narrative should absolutely showcase these bold actions of the suffragists in the face of both physical danger and public ridicule, making it the singular focus allowed the racial bias within the suffrage movement to remain hidden from the museum visitors. Krafchick's case study shows how a major reinterpretation project can take years, and in this instance, last for well over a decade. Now that the National Park Service operates the museum as the Belmont-Paul Women's Equality National Monument, work on a new interpretation plan that further explores biases and racism is underway. Next slide, please. One of the earliest historic sites named for a woman, the Frances Willard House, opened as a public museum in 1900, just 2 years after her death. Willard's personal papers and the organizational records of the Women's Christian Temperance Union are archived on site and available to the public. Under the leadership of museum director Lori Osborne, the museum has closely examined the conflict between Frances Willard and Ida B. Wells that played out in the early 20th century newspapers. This conflict began when Willard made racist comments during a newspaper interview. This was then followed by Wells's public comments, where she criticized Willard's comments and pointed out that they were simply not in keeping with Willard's international reputation as a Christian reformer. Their public animosity grew, and especially when Willard refused to fully acknowledge and support Wells's work on the critically important anti-lynching campaigns. Next slide, please. The final case study is not site-specific, but it is incredibly important nonetheless. When history practitioner Rebecca Price's research into suffrage and political activism of African-American women in Tennessee yielded no results, she questioned the findings and assumed correctly that the women did exist, but that the repositories just did not include them. To correct this, she launched a statewide community-based program digitizing the materials, noting the political contributions of African-American women in Tennessee before 1930. The project was a tremendous success, and the materials have all been digitized and donated to the Special Collections Center at the Nashville Public Library, and they are now available to both the public and researchers. Next slide. Earlier, I mentioned the need to convene what I call productive conversations as a way to understand the divisions and bias in the suffrage movement. The overarching goal being that we look deeper into the full story of suffrage and find ways to tie the historic narratives to contemporary issues such as voting rights, and then share these stories with our visitors. Given that the discourse around women's political participation is always a hot button issue, I know that that's much easier said than done. And the most common criticism that I hear about this work is that the content is seen as too political and too racially inflammatory. Next slide, please. The book lays out multiple strategies for addressing these issues, but today I want to focus on just two. The first is, I believe that we need to move past using a binary good or bad framework to discuss this history, and instead pivot to talk about the underlying systemic issues, not just the key players. Using the previous example of Alice Paul and the NWP, instead of using Alice's actions regarding the 1913 parade as the entry point to talking about racially motivated tactics, a more productive conversation would be to discuss how the Southern delegation's demand for a racially segregated parade impacted the event planning and set the stage for a major racial division in the suffrage movement going forward. In 2020, we acknowledged the centennial of the 19th Amendment. One of the best outcomes from the centennial is that in the last few years, there has been a significant amount of new material and scholarship about the suffrage movement that includes many, many women of color across the country. Next slide. Scholars such as Kathleen Cahill, Martha Jones, Marjorie Sproul, and Allison Parker, among so many others, have challenged our assumptions of women's enfranchisement and moved us toward a more inclusive and honest narrative. In her recent book, Sally Roche Wagner reminds us that a movement does not have a beginning or an end. And I strongly believe that expanding the narrative of enfranchisement from beyond 1848 to 1920 to include voting rights and citizenship is both timely and imperative. Making those direct connections between political activists of the suffrage movement to those in the civil rights era and then through to today can very easily be done. Certainly, everyone knows that voting rights, citizenship, and women's political participation are just as important today as they were 100 years ago. Next slide. Now, in 2008, when I was struggling with these issues, resources were not as available as they are today. Even so, I know that especially for those working in small museums, carving out the time for extensive research is nearly impossible. Given this, I include a significant number of additional materials in the book, breadcrumbs, if you will, that hopefully will help museum practitioners move forward in their research and understanding of the full story of women's enfranchisement. Here I list just a small portion of the additional materials. One that I want to point out is the National Votes for Women Trail, which is done by the National Collaborative for Women's History Sites. It's available online, and it is an incredible effort where thousands of markers, of historic markers, have been put up across the country, in every state across the country. And so many of them deal with women of color who worked previously unknown to us historians, whose work has really gone without notice. So please take a minute to get online and see that, because it is really incredible information. But I want to highlight two key pieces of the additional materials for you today that are included in the book. Next slide, please. The first is the International Sites of Conscience. I'm not sure if you're aware of this group, but please take a minute to look them up online. They do extraordinary work. They are an international organization, and they deal with a lot of issues that local museums don't, such as genocide and other huge environmental issues. They have a series of what they call front page dialogue booklets. And in those dialogues, they actually show you how to have conversations. And it is incredibly drilled down and even in the weeds, but it is very, very important. And it is a really nice way for an organization that doesn't have the staff to figure out how to do that on their own. It gives you a nice template. I'm always grateful to them because they graciously produced a brand new front page dialogue just on voting rights so that I could use it in this book. As I said, it's a step-by-step way in how to convene these important conversations in your communities. Next slide. Also in the book, in 2018, the Women's History Affinity Group of AASLH produced an online survey and then convened a roundtable conference session to discuss the expanded framework for suffrage content. The 19th Amendment Centennial Value Statement is the culmination of that work. It offers more than a dozen prompting questions, such as, what were the connections between the temperance movement and suffrage? And how did citizenship impact the suffrage movement? These questions will help guide internal and external conversations at your organizations. I want to switch gears, and I want to give some practical tips for museum staff, board members, and the visitors who've joined us today. Can I get the next slide, please? Okay, take action. For museum practitioners, it is incredibly important that we look for the gaps in our content. What you should be asking yourself is, as you walk through your galleries and you look at your exhibits, whose voices are you not sharing? Whose photos are not included on your exhibit panels? That's a good place to start. I urge you to form partnerships and convene groups within your community to talk about a reinterpretation or strategic process. Bringing people from the community in at the beginning is critical. When Laurie Osborne and the Frances Willard House embarked on their Telling the Truth project, they had community members from the very beginning, and they listened to the community members and acted on their thoughts. It made the project much more successful and very easy for the community to identify. And now it has increased the relevance of the Frances Willard Museum, which is something that I know all practitioners and all museums worry about. I've already said before, broaden their narrative around the enfranchisement to include voting rights. When you talk about voting rights across the country, it looks very different than it does from the vantage point of my work, which was at the Sewell Belmont House in Washington, D.C. So again, this is a great way for you to bring in and include local stories. Look outside of the archive, explore church records, sororities, etc. So many repositories, like we saw with the example from Rebecca Price, simply don't include women of color. So you really are going to have to get a little bit more creative and look outside of the box and go to churches, talk to sororities. Perhaps you would even embark on a digitization project like Rebecca did in Tennessee. These are all important things if we're going to expand our archival holdings. Right now, if you are going to, as a museum staff person, if you are going to curate a new exhibit and you go into your collection or your archive and you start to do the research, you might not have information about the women of color. You need to expand your archival holdings. And the book outlines several good kind of templates for you to undertake that. Also, find ways to educate your stakeholders and your board. By this, I mean, distribute reading lists that offer new scholarship. Show examples of other museum exhibits at like-minded sites that are really doing a good job of expanding their narrative, and also share material from when you are attending conferences. Share that information with, like I said, your stakeholders and your board. Next slide, please. So take action again. Now this is for donors and board members, and who I loosely consider all of those people to be stakeholders. Please encourage the staff and support their efforts to include a wide range of stories and narratives in their exhibits and programs. It's difficult work, it's very complicated, and as Alyssa said at the beginning, it's often difficult to even know where you want to start. Number two is difficult. Publicly acknowledge racial divisions in the historic content and within the organization. This is not easy, and I recognize that. It is something that I grappled with for, as I said, almost a decade at Sewell Belmont House, and it was really only after I left that I was able to have a little bit of time to really explore what were some of the options that I had that I probably didn't recognize at the time. Again, having the board and the staff be very upfront, and again, just acknowledge what divisions that you know exist. Sponsor staff training on diversity and inclusion. There are so many new resources that are available. Some of them are free. A lot of them are very low cost, so it's not prohibitive for even small museums to undertake. Just having just being able to participate in a short webinar or understand some of the main components for how you can start to address diversity and inclusion at your organization is really a great first step. Please ensure that staff can attend conferences and have other training opportunities. Having worked at small museums, I can tell you there's never a budget to send one staff member, let alone everybody, to a conference. One of the nicest things that a board member ever did for me, and I had some absolutely outstanding board members, but one of the nicest things is that she sponsored all 5 staff to attend a local conference for a single day. It was something we were never going to have the ability to pay for, and staff would have to cover that expense themselves personally. So it was really a lovely gift that she gave us. I would also encourage you to form an outside advisory committee. Collection acquisition, how you expand your archival holdings. These are important pieces, and you've got I'm sure, a tremendous museum staff that can help guide you on the ways in which you can do that. That said, it's always important to reach out to your community and to other communities and really make sure that you're listening to everybody who has the potential to be a visitor at your site. If they have the potential to be a visitor at your site, then they should be listened to and they should be heard. We're never going to expand our archival collections if we're simply talking to ourselves over and over again. We really do need to branch out and make sure that we're talking with the community. And last, fund research fellowships, if you are able, fund research fellowships that encourage new scholarship. When the National Woman's Party dissolved at the end of 2020, the archival holdings went to the National Park Service and also to the Library of Congress. Along with the donation of materials to the Library of Congress, they were able to give a small nest egg of funding that now will start to fund small stipends for researchers who want to come into the area and actually research in the NWP papers. I cannot tell you how critical this is. As a museum practitioner, as I've said a couple of times, it's very hard to be able to carve out the time to do this in-depth work. So because of that, we really do rely on our academic scholars and friends and colleagues, and we really need them to have access to these papers and to these archives so that they can do a deep dive, and then we can all learn from what they've come up with from the archive. So again, these fellowships, the small stipends, even a small stipend to help defray some of the expenses of travel, or even if they're local, just a small couple $100 really does go a long way. So if you have the ability, I would urge you to take a look at that. Next slide. So when I first began to write this book, I had multiple colleagues tell me, Paige, you need to write the book that you needed when you had these questions. When you were boots on the ground at Sewell Belmont House, write that book that you needed. And so that's what I have done. Today, we know that presenting an all-white narrative at our museums and institutions is just as unacceptable as presenting an all-male narrative. That said, it can be extremely difficult to bring about these changes and address these complicated topics. I hope that the materials in this book will offer a way for visitors, for board members, and certainly museum practitioners to hold honest conversations that lead to more inclusive exhibits and programs at our museums. Thank you very much. I will turn it back to Alyssa, and I am eager to take your questions.
Thank you, Paige. I hope everybody found that as interesting as I did. I love this book, and I hope that many of you who are interested in history, even if you're not active practitioners, will get a copy and read it, maybe share it among your communities or organizations, because it's really powerful just to read about the work people are doing to help you understand how you engage with these sites when you go to visit them or come to programs like this. So we have a couple questions in the Q&A. And we have a few about Judaism and Jewish women. And this is one that I always find very interesting as a woman of Jewish heritage myself. People, I don't know where the story of Alice being an anti-Semite comes from, but knowing what I do about her history, and you're welcome to take this or I can, I've always found it very puzzling. Because during Alice's stint in Geneva in the 1930s, leading the World Women's Party, she turned her villa in Switzerland into a safe haven for Jewish intellectuals who were fleeing the Nazi regime, and used her influence to secure visas for many of them, some of whom still live in our area today, and who we at the Institute have an active relationship with.
Why don't we tag team it? Okay. So tell me, I have not myself done that personal research. So why don't you share more of your thoughts, and then I can chime in.
Well, so this is, I think, just in terms of the anti-Semitism question, I have a hard time believing that active anti-Semitism was a part of her belief system or behavior, given her Quaker heritage, and that emphasis on the inner light in all people, but also again because she worked very, very hard and opened up her home to a number of Jewish refugees and families. And we actually have some materials that I am very happy to share with people if they want to email me, ahunt@alicepaul.org. I'll drop it in the chat. That I'm happy to share with you interviews with Felix and Alice Muller and their children. That was one of the couples who relocated to Atco, New Jersey, which is just down the road. But beyond that, the other question we had was about Jewish women in the movement. which I think actually dovetails really nicely with something you and I were discussing earlier, Paige, about how we have this binary conversation about bias as though women of African descent are the only people who experienced racism, and how we really need to change that conversation. So maybe you can start by talking about Jewish women and then maybe go a little bit more into what we discussed earlier.
Yeah. So I think it's interesting because it's often one of the things that I have come to completely understand is wherever you start, as far as your personal perspective, that's your lens. That's how you look at life. That's how you look at these various pieces of history. I too agree that given what we know, and you have probably done more research into Alice's early life than I have, but given what we know about her Quaker upbringing, I know that inequality was something that she worked against. Gender inequality was something that she worked against every day. And I have a hard time believing that, again, she would have gone down any of those roads that we were talking about. I can tell you that when I was doing the research, which is really where the bulk of information comes from this book, is about the black and white binary racism. And what I can tell you is that over the years that I was at Sewell Belmont, I had many opportunities to talk about racism in the movement, et cetera, with individuals on programs or something along those lines. What I was not able to do was be able to do enough research and be able to really include that in the exhibits themselves. But one of the things that I did find, and I will pass along to you just because it was an interesting viewpoint, I have said, and I have said multiple times, when I was at that organization as the director, it was not my job to apologize for Alice. It was not my job to make anybody think that she was a heroine, an icon. That was not my job. My job was to run the organization. My job was to share the history in the most up-to-date and honest way that I possibly could. And we were able to do that in large case. But one of the conversations that I had that was absolutely pivotal in the way that I thought when I think about Alice, going back to that slide where I said in that very early conversation, when the stakeholder very concretely told me that she believes Alice is a racist, and she will tell you that today as well. Absolutely. But it comes down to the definition of racist. So if you know of Dr. Rosalind Terborg Penn, she has passed away in 2018, but she was an amazing African-American scholar. And we hosted a panel discussion with her at the National Archive once. And she was very clear about saying that she too believed that Alice, she was labeling her as a racist. And the reason why is because her definition of racist is a little bit different than I think a lot of other people's definition is. So in her mind, if you were a person of privilege, if you were a white person and you were not working every day to correct racial inequality in your community and in our country, that made you a racist. So see, she had a very narrow, very clear definition. And if you look at that, if you look at Alice and the NWP using that definition, then yes, you can absolutely say that Alice at almost every point really refused to engage along Black equality for women. She was simply looking at it through the lens of gender. So again, I think that some of this, the perception is that some of this comes from, where are you starting from? What is your opinion going forward? What is your background? What do you believe to be important? And so again, it comes down to definitions. And that's where it gets really complicated. But I think the important thing here is an organization, in my opinion, I do not believe that an organization should be stating who is and making labels, this or that. I think it's about telling the story, telling it in a way that it interacts with as many people as possible and that it rings true. Not everybody is going to like that history, and some people are going to take the opportunity to walk away, but it's important for the organization to do this. And again, Dr. Rosalind Terborg Penn, she would, her definition of racism is really in line with what other scholars have written recently about being an anti-racist. So if that's a new term for you, I urge you to look it up. There are some really tremendous books out there on the subject, and they really do give you a better understanding of this other viewpoint.
I think that it's a hard thing for many of us to grapple with, because many of us were raised with the understanding that if you are a racist, you are not a good person, and
Right.
that if you do racist things, you can't be a good person. And there's this very deep cultural morality tied into that notion. And until we're able to divorce our sense of ourselves as moral people from the reality of the fact that many of us and many of our cultural heroes and political heroes have done actions that we would also find morally reprehensible by our current standards, then it's going to be very hard to have these conversations and figure out we can't undo the legacies of the past, but we can, Toni Morrison had that great quote, "We do our best until we know better, and then we do better." And
Right.
It's very hard to do better if you can't acknowledge that your best wasn't good enough by your standards that you hold today, even if it was yesterday.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I had a really interesting conversation with someone once, and I allude to it in the book. She was asking me, she was somebody who had known about Alice Paul. She is somebody that had marched for women's rights in the 60s and 70s. This woman had gravitas, and there was no way that I was going to, let's just say, I had no intention of making her feel uncomfortable, or that I in any way disrespected anything that she did or so many others did right before I came along. So I was trying very hard to just come to a place where we could have an understanding of what we both thought to be true. And one of the things that she said was, we have and this is just my words, this is not verbatim, but what she said is, in women's history, we have so few women that we can call icons, right? We have so few women that even make it into history books. Why do we need to disparage the few that we have? Why do we need to pick at them? Why do we need to add these other items? Why these other things, like you said, that they have done in the past? Why do we need to talk about that? And I said, well, I don't believe that we need to take any of our feminist icons and knock them off their pedestal. That's not what I think we should do. But I also don't believe that we should keep them chained to that pedestal. Women are complicated. History is complicated. In my opinion, there is no reason for us not to give a full understanding of that and share the information that we have without passing judgment. Again, as a museum professional, that is not my job. It is simply my job to make sure I have the most up-to-date, most accurate information, and that I share it in the most compelling way possible. And then we have conversations. And whether she took my point of view or I took her point of view, it really doesn't matter. It was a conversation, and that's the point. The point is that, until we have multiple conversations and we keep talking about this, we're never going to get to a place where we have a good general understanding of it, which, in my opinion, is going to harm museums and certainly women's history sites.
Well, and especially in the current cultural moment where books like How to Be an Anti-Racist and these conversations and the idea of critical race theory are kind of at the forefront. One thing that you and I know as museum and history practitioners is that cultural organizations die if they don't continue to engage new generations and younger generations. And the only way to stay relevant is to participate in the dialogues they are having and not insist that they come to us on our terms. Yeah. So part of it is, there's a pragmatic, as well as a moral aspect, there's a pragmatic aspect to it too. We have to be willing to participate in the conversations people are currently having, not just the ones we've had previously.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, there are plenty of examples of women who worked alongside Alice, in the suffrage movement and in the years before, who absolutely believed that that enfranchisement should include Black women and women of color. So but until you really dig into that, until you start to tell all of that story and craft your narrative around that, you're really not going to be able to present that to the public in a way that becomes valuable and valid. It's not, in my opinion, again, not the role of a museum to not be involved. There's a kind of you've probably heard of this, although some of the people participating may have not. It's called museums are not neutral. So there's always kind of a backlash against being too political, being too racially motivated, et cetera. Museums should take a stand. They should present information that is harder for people to understand. Museums are the lens in which our visitors can understand and have that context. That's the beauty of a museum. But I also believe that a museum should be able to have conversations that move past even what the museum might think. And this is how, and I have said through multiple slides, to really make sure that the community is involved so that you are having 360-degree conversations, not just conversations about what the museum should present to groups of people. The visitors should be involved from the get-go. These should be conversations that museums just get comfortable having. Definitely.
I love that the International Sites of Conscience really advocates for what they call the dialogic model. And it's something that we at Alice Paul Institute are trying, as we look to the future, to integrate into the experience visitors will have when they come there. And for those of you attending, the dialogic model supposes that the most significant experience someone can have when they visit these places is one in which they participate in a dialogue and where we have a conversation. I loved what you said during the program about conversations versus accusations, because a lot of people will sometimes come out, just like fist swinging, they were racist, this was wrong, it's a white supremacist group. And it's very hard to go anywhere from that place. It's very hard to go anywhere from being labeled as a thing that already has I know I keep talking about morality, but in the same way that museums and historical institutions are inherently political, we're also inherently moral. And the stories that we choose to tell, they demonstrate that our politics and our morality. And that's a very important thing, I think, for people to be aware of as they visit these places. There's in the 60s and 70s, there was a lot of conversation, especially in like African-American movements, about how the personal is political. And we have to be aware that our experience is translatable into that of many other people, though we don't speak for others. And we also have to be aware that the choices we make impact the experiences other people have, and that I think we might say is one of the big flaws of the early suffrage movement, was a failure to recognize that the choices that they made were going to have these impacts. I work with a lot of teenagers and I tell them, we don't know what would have happened if Alice had just advocated and said, absolutely not, these women are here, they're part of it, like I'm not going to allow other people's feelings to influence, where women march in the parade. We don't know what would have happened, but we do know what happened because she didn't do that. And it was that we needed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and that Chinese Americans weren't allowed to vote until the Magnuson Act in 1943. But I'm loving this conversation, but there are a few other questions and comments I really want to get to. I just want to offer to everyone that there are some books about Jewish women in New York City, The Woman's Hour by Elaine Weiss being a great one. And Ballots, Babies, and Banners of Peace by Melissa Clapper that someone offered to us. So thank you for that. Jill Zahniser, who I'm sure you know, for those of you who don't know, Jill Zahniser is the author of a book called Claiming Power. It is a phenomenal biography of Alice Paul. If you were interested in her life in the suffrage movement, please read it. She also narrates it herself in the Audible version, the audiobook version of it, which is very pleasant. She's got a great voice. But she says that her own biography of Alice and Martha S. Jones's recent book, Vanguard, both challenge the notion that Black women marched at the end of the parade. Most of the evidence is in correspondence of the NWP, which is not super accessible to the ordinary person. So how do we bridge this gap between common knowledge and historical record?
Right, it is. And I think that comes down to, so first off, yes, she's absolutely right. African-American women, and I was careful the way that I phrased this, African-American women were expected to march at the back of the parade, but I don't say that they absolutely had to march at the back of the parade, because we know that Black women did not. We know that they marched with their sororities. We know that they marched with their other community groups. So the issue being that is, how accessible is this information, and do your archives include it? And the answer for NWP is no. The information is just not there. Kathleen Cahill's research is the newest that I have read, and she found some information that was extremely helpful. But again, I think the part of this that is difficult and yet the most, in my opinion, brilliant thing about my job as a public historian is the fact that this is so nuanced. Every time we read something new, every time we go to a new archive, we have a new understanding of it. So this infuriates me when people today sometimes talk about, well, how come we have to rewrite the history? Well, we're not rewriting the history. We're simply adding to it because we've learned something new. And anyone who has ever worked in an archive knows that you have boxes and boxes of unprocessed material, and you might know maybe what's in those boxes, but in most cases you probably don't. And it takes years to go through and read and catalog and then digitize and provide finding aids and all of that. And so it's not. And so researchers, true academic researchers, need to have access to these repositories, because it takes them weeks and sometimes months to go through and read hundreds and hundreds of pages and then analyze that and then put that against something that they might have something else that they might think or know to be true, and then to be able to craft a narrative. So it is not, museum exhibits are not, you're never going to get to a place where you have the definitive story and it is up on the wall and now you can walk away and be done with it. No, there's always new information. There's always a new vantage point, a new viewpoint, and museum personnel should always be challenging themselves to ask those questions. Who's not up on the wall? Whose voices are we not seeing? Whose faces are we not seeing on these walls? And then to challenge that. And so it is, as I said, I mentioned kind of tangentially the National Woman's Party information, the papers that are at the Library of Congress. There's a new small fellowship to give research stipends. It's not going to change the world, but it is at least going to allow resources and help for scholars whose academic departments don't offer them any type of travel incentive, even if it's just a little bit of money to help defray a train ticket or something along those lines. It really does make a big difference. And I think this is one of the to loop this around, I think that this period that we have been experiencing, COVID and our global pandemic, with all of the number of museums and repositories that have been closed to the public, we're behind. Now we're really behind, because we need to make up for these few years, to be doing the research, to be cataloging the information, to be making sure that we're digitizing it and getting it up online so that everybody has access to it. And we were behind before, and now I'm afraid that we're even further behind. But I'm excited to see, as I said earlier, some of the new scholarship that's come out around the suffrage movement in the last few years. And I think that in the next few years going forward, we're going to see even more. The 2023, next year, is the 100th anniversary of the Equal Rights Amendment. So there's a whole lot of more conversations that need to take place about that. Most people, as you all probably know, most people don't know that. And most people think it's part of law. And
more than 50% of Americans, think that the ERA has already become the law.
Exactly.
If you want to learn more about the ERA, please go to equalrightsamendment.org. It's a website the Alice Paul Institute maintains, and email me as well. I'd love to have more conversations about that. You did make me think, we are running out of time a little bit, but you made me think about an amazing conference I attended virtually last year. They are so important. It was, the keynote speaker was David Pilgrim, who was the founder of the Jim Crow Museum of Racist Memorabilia at Ferris University. And one thing he said really stuck out to me: the past is what happened. History is what we say happened. Mm-hmm. We are not stewards of the past. We are stewards of history.
Right.
And what we say happened is dependent on so many different factors. And just like with good science, good history should change. And we have to be open to that truth and to understanding that our understanding needs to be flexible and dynamic, and that we have to be willing to change our opinions, and sometimes to hear things that kind of hurt our feelings and make us deeply uncomfortable or even offended, so that we can then figure out why we're feeling that way and what our pushback is. Is it because it's truly offensive or terrible, or is it because it challenges something we want to believe about ourselves or about other people? And part of our job as keepers of this and stewards of this history is to keep people feeling a little bit uncomfortable and asking hard questions.
Yeah, and having those conversations that come out of them. Yes, absolutely.
So Paige, thank you so much for everything you have offered us today. And to all of our attendees, thank you for being a part of this conversation, which may have gone to some uncomfortable places. We really appreciate and value all of you. You will all be receiving an email that asks for your follow-up. Please take 5 minutes to fill out our feedback form for API and let us know what you think about this. Also, this chat has been incredible. There are so many resources, people sharing book recommendations and websites and different places you can go. My email and Paige's email are in there. The website and discount code for the book are in there. If you just look in your chat box, click those 3 little dots and click Save Chat, you'll have all of it there so that you can reference it back so you don't have to write it down or remember it now. I highly recommend buying and reading Paige's book. It's awesome. And if you enjoyed this, we would be so grateful if you'd pop over to alicepaul.org and making a donation to help us continue to bringing you this kind of programming at no cost. So happy birthday to Alice, which is on January 11th. I think this is a great way to honor her birthday, is by having these conversations about her legacy, not about her as a person, but about the work she did, and how to further equality, which is what she always wanted.
Right, right. Thank you all so much.
All right, take care, everybody.